The trans debate has always been controversial, whether it's the early days of Christine Jorgensen down to the Gender Recognition Act of 2004 in the UK, and especially in modern times where the trans debate is becoming more and more to the forefront of modern discourse. But what is easily the most divisive subject within all of this is the issue of transgender children. Now, both sides in this debate have very, very strong feelings about what they consider to be child abuse in one way or another. The trans activist side will have you believe that any child who says that they are whatever gender must be respected, and therefore to stop a 4-year-old from changing gender to be a girl would be child abuse. But in the same line, the side which is completely against any kind of transitioning for young people would say that transitioning itself is not only child abuse, but is also gay or lesbian erasure. Now, I've kind of held off talking about this topic for a while, and that's because I wanted to construct my views as much as I possibly can. As I mentioned, this is highly controversial, and whilst I'm sure what I will say will no doubt irk some people on either side, I do want to just explain that my views on this are always going to be evolving, and nothing that I think is ultimately going to be set in stone. But this is something I've been looking into over the last couple of weeks to kind of build a bit more of a stronger position, or at least what I would really want to explain to people as to what my views on young people transitioning actually is. Now, I think it might be a good place to start with my own background. Now, obviously, I'm a transsexual woman, and yes, when I was younger, I certainly dealt with gender dysphoria. I was very uncomfortable as a child, but that really went into overdrive when I hit puberty. All of a sudden, I really became aware of all the changes that your body goes through. I became incredibly uncomfortable. I became very depressed, very angry. And it was only when I started transitioning at the age of 19 that I actually felt some sort of normality within my life, and I finally found a little bit of peace. So with all that being said, it should be a done deal, right? I mean, I was a young person who dealt with gender dysphoria myself, so surely I would support the transition at any age to really deal with what are very difficult and very painful feelings. Well, it's not really quite so simple. Now, I do think it might be worth pointing out that there have been children transitioning for quite a long time. In fact, the gender identity services in the UK that have been dealing with children have been around as long as 1989. Now, let's take a look at some of the things which their website says about how they would come to the conclusion that a child should be transitioning. Now, the Gender Identity Development Services site actually links to a specific article about the assessment and support of children and adolescents with gender dysphoria. So this would be a really good place to start to get a good understanding of what the medical side actually goes through. Again, now before I go into this, it's important for me to say that this might not necessarily be the exact criteria used by the GIDS. However, this is a website which is linked on their website, so they encourage you to go and look at it. So this might be something to take into consideration, because it turns out that there are actually two different kinds of criteria for gender dysphoria, one for adults and one for children. So the criteria that they give for adults is something that really hits home for me. These are things that I can very much relate to, such as a strong desire to be rid of one's primary and secondary sex characteristics, a strong desire to be of the other gender and to be treated as the other gender, and a strong conviction that one has the typical feelings and reactions of the other gender. This is something which I think a lot of people who deal with gender dysphoria can indeed agree with. But the criteria that they give for children is a little bit strange. It starts off well by saying there's a strong desire to be of the other gender, or an insistence that one is the other gender. I can understand that. But then it goes into issues such as wearing clothes typical of the opposite gender, a strong preference across gender roles in make-believe or fantasy play, a strong preference for the toys, games or activities stereotypically used or engaged in by the other gender, a strong preference for playmates of the other gender, a rejection of toys for the other gender. Whilst it ends reasonably enough with dislike of sexual anatomy and a desire for sexual characteristics of the other sex, a lot of this is quite troubling. The idea that a child could be labelled as having gender dysphoria because they have, for example, if you had a young boy who had a lot of friends who were girls, or that they weren't into typically male or typically female activities. Little Timmy doesn't like playing footy, or guess he must be a tranner then. Go get his hormones. Now, I should make it clear that one of the common misconceptions when it comes to trans kids is that you can find children as young as 6 being given hormones. That isn't actually the case. In fact, it would only be at the ages of around 11, I believe, is the youngest, that they would be given hormone blockers and not necessarily hormones themselves. Whilst I know that that's still controversial, that's an important clarification to make, because you do often hear of children as young as 3 going through the system. That isn't to say that 3-year-olds are being pumped full of drugs, but rather that they are discussing gender identity issues at such a young age. So should a 3-year-old be going through the system? Well, let's have a look at some of the studies that have been done on young people to get a better understanding of what that case could be. For example, in January 2016, Dr. James Cantor wrote a blog piece where he had a look in several different reports that had been carried out on young trans people. And he says that despite the differences in country, culture, decade and follow-up length and method, all the studies have come to a remarkably similar conclusion. Only very few trans kids still want to transition by the time they are adults. Instead, they generally turn out to be regular gay or lesbian folks. The exact number varies by study, but roughly 60 to 90% of trans kids turn out to no longer be trans by adulthood. An example of one of these studies was done in 2007, known as the psychosexual outcome of gender dysphoric children. They concluded by saying most children with gender dysphoria will not remain gender dysphoric after puberty, and those with persistent gender identity disorder are characterised by more extreme gender dysphoria in childhood than children with desisting gender dysphoria. Now, it is quite hard to really read what a child actually has. As you've seen with the criteria, it's a little bit wishy-washy, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people who are watching this who might not have been gender conforming as children. And you would hope that this kind of thing would at least mean that those going through the system would have this caught. And I should mention that I am not a medical professional. I do understand, though, that there is this system that has been around for a long time, and I'm hoping that they do indeed take a lot of these reports into account. And one of the studies that really speaks to me is this one on desisting and persisting gender dysphoria after childhood, where it states that adolescents with persisting gender dysphoria and those in whom the gender dysphoria remitted indicated that they considered the period between 10 and 13 years of age to be crucial. And if we're going to talk about a minimum age for any kind of transition, I think that that would be around it. As I mentioned earlier, blockers might be given as young as 11, but around that time period is when you get a better understanding of who you are. And that rings true to me. As I mentioned at the start, when I was going through puberty, that was when things really became too much. And so then was when I knew. And whilst I could certainly look back and say, well, it was the dysphoria when I was a little kid, I probably wouldn't be in a real position to say so. And this is why I find it quite worrying when we see young people being told that they need to transition. And this really does appear to be a thing that we are dealing with. We've seen posts on social media about 4-year-olds being given new birth certificates because it turns out that they were actually a girl, even though they were born male. Or we have the family where you have 2 transitioning young people, very young ages, both of them just so happen to be trans. And I do feel that a lot of this is indeed being pushed by political ideology. And you can see this with a lot of the media that is being pushed at these people. A very good example of this would be a quite strange YouTube channel known as Queer Kids Stuff. Now, I've always believed that this channel, deep down, is actually a parody because I don't think anyone can really take it seriously. And whilst they have actually quite low viewing figures nowadays and not that many subscribers, the channel is most well known for people making fun of it online. And yet, despite all that, they still seem to be getting invited to talk in libraries, to be put up as an example of, this is who should be speaking to children. So we probably should be taking this at least a little bit seriously. And I don't think that this is something which is really aimed at children so much. I mean, yes, you can point at the likes of Teddy, the really patronising, absolutely crap character that is included in this, who is a they-them Teddy, by the way, as something that must appeal to children. But I feel as though this is just adults making something for other adults that they can then say, well, this is for kids. And when you listen to a lot of transitioning children, they don't talk like children. And you don't just see this from trans children, but indeed many kids that are put front and centre in politics. Drag kids, while certainly not being trans, have a very similar line, where they appear to be LGBT activists at the age of 8. These kids don't seem to be coming out with this organically. They seem to be getting fed this from virtue signalling progressives, as though this is the way in which everything should be going. And a lot of this is disturbing to me. And I would be very cautious about anyone projecting any kind of gender or sexuality on a child. They need to come to that conclusion on their own. And when you're filling kids' heads up with ideas of multiple genders and that everyone can be anything, yeah, it doesn't surprise me that we're seeing big jumps in the amount of children who are being referred to these gender clinics. Now, that shouldn't really be much of an issue though, right? I mean, you have these medical professionals who should be able to weed out the indoctrination. Unfortunately, that doesn't really seem to be the case either. In a story I covered on Trans Stupid a number of weeks ago, a psychotherapist from the Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation Trust, which is one of the main centres for young people with gender dysphoria, noted that politicised trans groups were actually putting kids at risk. They are pushing through all of these ideas on anyone should be able to go through a transition. They want to tear down any idea of there being real gender health services for trans people, and for everything to just be self-ID and simply self-referential, that you decide that you have gender dysphoria, so therefore you can get your hormones. I mean, you look at groups like Action for Trans Health, and they're quite explicit in wanting to tear down the medical pathway for transition. They just want it to be a free-for-all, and this is very dangerous for young people who are already very impressionable. It doesn't allow the medical professionals to do their jobs, and that's why I'm generally quite reserved when it comes to young people transitioning. Now, I would say an age such as 16, I think that at that point, personally, I would say that that would be an age where someone can make that decision. And indeed, you can see people who might even have started at 15. Miss London is an example of someone who started at 15, and she's clearly very grounded, and it was definitely the right decision for her. But the issue with being someone who transitioned quite a while ago and has the luxury of foresight in all of this is that ultimately we're not talking about ourselves in this. It's all well and good for me to say, well, I could have been put on blockers when I was 11 years old. I could have been given hormones at the age of 13 or 14, and it would have worked out for me just fine, and it would have. But we're not talking about ourselves here, we're talking about other people, and can we really make the same call for others that we would have been able to make for ourselves? We probably can't. In an ideal world, we'll be able to leave it to the medical professionals to sort out exactly who has gender dysphoria and who doesn't, and ultimately make sure that they're getting the right level of treatment. If we've got a lot of support, a lack of influence from queer ideology, I would support a transition for a young person. I do not support medical transitioning until around the age of 16. I'm still not comfortable with hormone blockers at the age of 11. I still think that is a bit risky, but ultimately, until trans politics ultimately leaves transitioning kids alone, I think erring on the side of caution is the best bet. There is too much of a push to politicise everything. And when we see kids being told in schools that they can identify as anything and being asked what gender they are, or being given gender spectrums and saying, where do you sit on this? Kids are going to be impressioned by this, and it is going to influence what they think. We need to go back to gender dysphoria being the reason why people are transitioning and not through personal choice, especially when it involves a medical pathway. And I think we do need to put a stop to all this virtue signalling of people even younger who are all of a sudden coming out as being trans, and all of a sudden anyone who questions it is considered transphobic. I mean, we've seen plenty of stories over the last couple of months with people who question this and it's branded as bigotry. I do think that it's right to show some concern over this, but at the same time, I think it would be fair to acknowledge that gender dysphoria is something that is quite difficult to deal with. We just need to make sure that trans kids are actually getting the care that they need. That is the most important part of this. And until we can be sure that's really what's going on, maybe being cautious is probably the best approach. So what are your thoughts on this? I know that this is a very controversial subject, and I'm sure that some of the things that I've said have upset a couple of people, but let me know what you think in the comments anyway. Thank you all for hearing me out. I do appreciate it. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. You can also follow me on Twitter, and I will see you all next time.
And a special thank you to Gotta Get Me, Prue, The Poor of Rizzo, James C. George, James UK, James Dorans, a lot of Jameses, Evil Moist, Sarah, and the rest of my supporters on Patreon and Subscribe.